from Yes We Cannibal. Welcome to this week's edition of Meat Meat.
We're thrilled to welcome John Clark from Bayou La Terre to talk about his work as an activist, a writer, philosopher, and especially his latest book, Between Earth and Empire, which we have right here, and you can purchase where, John?
Well, you could get it from PM Press, I suppose, would be the best place. Please.
Thanks so much for joining us. I first met you through Bayou La Terre. Maybe that would be a great way to kind of introduce the book.
Right. I mean, it's great to be introduced through a bayou.
But
Blame it on the bayou.
Do you want to tell us about how Bayou La Terre started? Because I think that's such an interesting story, and it's a living example of the kinds of communities you talk about in your book.
Well, it's a community of life. It's a creek. It's called Bayou La Terre. We're not sure why it's called Bayou La Terre.
Oh, it was named that before you got there.
The bayou is called Bayou La Terre. Yeah, it's been called Bayou La Terre for a long time. And the land was French for quite a while. It's on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It's about 65 miles from New Orleans. And the area, of course, it goes way back, and I don't know what the indigenous name of the bayou was. We have an indigenous group that has a sweat lodge ceremony there regularly. And I wouldn't be surprised if they would find out and maybe reveal to us a more ancient name. But the area was French and Spanish. East of Bay St. Louis, the bay, was settled by Anglo-Saxon kind of people. But west of there were a lot of French and Spanish people who were there. And so that's why the name is Bayou La Terre in French. But I've always been very happy that when I heard about some land and decided to buy a little bit of land and then more and more over the years, that it turned out to be Bayou La Terre, because the next bayou over is called Rotten Bayou.
Oh, God.
It's a pretty famous bayou around there. It's a major bayou. And they all run into the Jordan River and then ultimately into Bay St. Louis. But that's where what it came from. It came from the name came from the actual bayou, which runs through the land out there. We have 88 acres. We have a bridge across the bayou. And we now have a couple of houses, a cabin, a couple of little cabins that we're trying to finish, a workshop, a couple of other buildings, a big pavilion. So we're hoping to have a lot of activities there in the future, since we haven't had any in the last year, other than the indigenous group, which has come regularly. They were just there about a week ago. They're coming in small numbers. They only allow like 5 people to get together because they're all in the sweat lodge together. So they're being really careful. But I've been very happy that they've continued to meet in the midst of the pandemic. At least a couple of people have come out every couple of weeks. And you can hear the drumming, you can hear the activity going on there. And it's been comforting and encouraging that still goes on when not a lot of other things are going on. Other than that, we've been doing things online. And we have our 2 groups, the APE group, which I'm sure you know because you're a co-sponsor, of the Anarchist Political Ecology group, which meets every Sunday morning at 11:30. And then we also have the Dialectical Social Ecology group, which meets on Wednesday nights. So we have been active, but we haven't been active in person.
John, are you the most prolific person you know?
Well, that's a very generic word.
I ask because
I mean, I don't consider myself prolific in any sense.
In terms of just words, though, you have an ability to produce words, and good words, useful words, that is really beyond anyone I know. It is a joy, and also sometimes blows my mind that I will receive, oh, I just wrote this piece. I was curious if you had any thoughts. And it's 10 pages of brilliance that just show up in my email box. And you write more than anyone I know. And so I'm really curious about this. I'm really curious about how you, there's a chance to put you on the spot. I'm really curious about how you relate to your writing.
I mean, I love to talk about writing. But I certainly don't feel the way you do about my writing, because what impresses me is how much I haven't done. I have, I don't know if you know where this comes from. It comes from the Book of Common Prayer. I have done things I ought not to have done, and I have left undone things I ought to have done. More or less, it's a paraphrase, and that's how I feel about writing. It's always, sometimes I'm amazed when I look back at things I wrote 30, 40, and now 50 years ago, that they aren't worse than they are. So I'm happy about that. But
what are you working on now, John? Since you just put out this book, so.
Well, I've been working on a couple of other books. I mean, what I'm working on now, it's hard for me to remember what I did 2 or 3 weeks ago, to be honest. I did a couple of things on anarchist political ecology. I did prefaces to 3 books that Simon Springer and other people edited on that subject. And I also did something on really dialectical social ecology for a book that's going to be done in Spanish. It's going to be translated for that book. And since then, I've been thinking a lot about the Paris Commune. The anniversary is coming up in just a few days. So we have these 2 big anniversaries, the Kronstadt centennial, and also the anniversary of 150 years since the Paris Commune. So I wrote something on Élysée Reclus and the Paris Commune, which will be in Roar magazine soon. They're doing a series of, I think, 8 or maybe 12. Maybe it's 8. I think every week during the commemoration, they're going to have one article on the Paris Commune. So I've been thinking a lot about the Paris Commune, and of course Kronstadt, because we're co-sponsoring.
Well, and just to interrupt slightly, I was not very familiar. I'd heard the phrase. I really knew almost nothing about Kronstadt until quite recently, and I wonder if you could say something about that, just for the audience who may come across this.
Well, it was a very important event in revolutionary history. In 1921, and it was a revolt of the sailors who were considered, very heroic to begin with. Of course, the Soviet government turned against them and ultimately crushed it. But in a sense, they were taking seriously the rhetoric of the revolution. That the revolution, there were certain words that were used, like communism, which many people thought might have something to do with a commune and communal self-determination. And the term Soviet, which meant council. And a lot of people thought, well, maybe people should, determine the fate of their own community, and also they should have councils to carry out a lot of their own decisions and the will of the people. So the Kronstadt sailors stood up for that, and for a very short period of time held out against repressive forces that ultimately crushed them, the Red Army under Trotsky. So it's a very important, heroic event. Volin did this book called The Unknown Revolution, which was about the Russian Revolution in the large sense, which included 1905. It included the Kronstadt rebellion. It included the Makhnevist revolution in the Ukraine. So the Russian Revolution was a much larger thing than just what we hear about, which is the October. There's also the February Revolution, but we hear a lot about the October Revolution, but there was a very large revolutionary movement that went on for many years. And there were great achievements of the revolution in this larger sense. So part of that history is commemorated with the centennial of Kronstadt.
And I see that someone from the conference, probably Javier, just did post that in our Twitch chat, and we'll certainly post that as well, and are really excited about it and trying to help out in any way we can. Do you think Occupy Wall Street was the beginning of a revolution?
A revolution?
Small revolution in the United
How
States.
small?
Well, what I mean is, do you, from your vantage point, what do you see as kind of the enduring significance? Because we're at the 10-year anniversary.
I think it has revolutionary aspects. I've been very vocal against the idea that Occupy was just a failure. Because the question is, on what basis do you assess any phenomenon? And the concept that I like to think about is formation. We can use a lot of other words for it. Personal history, group history, and so forth. And people go through a history of developing in certain ways or not developing in others. One of the things I like about Élisée Reclus in his view of history, he wrote a lot about evolution and revolution, and he has a famous chapter on progress in his great book, L'Homme et la Terre, Humanity and the Earth, which ends with this chapter on progress. And he says every phenomenon has progressive, and if we want to use progressive in a positive sense, rather than in the conventional sense, every phenomenon has progressive and regressive dimensions, from in dialectical talk, moments, and it has other dimensions which are neither progressive nor regressive. Every phenomenon is very complex. And even we might even say the progressive aspects have regressive dimensions and vice versa also. So to get back to Occupy, I hope we get back to writing too, because we were going to talk about
We will.
that.
There's really so much that my mind is trying to map out
because I
all
really
the
like
things
to
we want
talk
ask
about
you.
writing. But I'll tell you what I loved about Occupy. One thing I loved about Occupy, which I think certainly became part of people's lives, the People's Mic. And the reason why I loved it so much is that I know that there were thousands and thousands of people who had never been listened to before, but who were encouraged to express themselves. There was a very strong feeling of work by consensus, participation is important. Let people who are not speaking speak.
And can you just, because we have a broad audience, what is the People's Mic?
Well, I was going to talk about exactly what there was about
No,
it.
but I'm thinking that for instance,
I'll do that.
Some of our interns are in third years in college.
I wanted to say what there is about it that I thought was so good, which is what it was.
Okay.
Yeah, what it was. The good thing about it is what it was. And what it was, we can also talk about what it was not, because everything is what it isn't also. But what it was a process in which people got a chance to take their turn speaking. And originally, there were large crowds and it was hard to hear people, and they were not allowed to have electricity. So they discovered that if everybody who was close enough to them to hear would repeat each phrase, so people got good at this. Instead of coming out with long sentences or even sentences, they learned how to enunciate part of a sentence that could be repeated by other people. People got practice in this. So people repeated what the speaker was saying, and that was the People's Mic. And then sometimes even people who couldn't hear but could hear the people who heard could sort of chime in and do it quickly enough so you could get it all the way to the back. But usually, in New Orleans, for instance, it probably wasn't more than a couple of hundred people usually, and it worked very well. But what impressed me about it was first that because there was this participatory spirit, people were encouraged to do it, even if they hadn't done it in the past. And also, I think people who were not brave enough to do it in the conventional way saw other people doing it and developed, the courage to do it. And then the other thing was that when people speak, even if they haven't spoken much, you never know who's listening and who isn't, and people space out and so forth. But if you're going to repeat every word that someone says, you have to pay attention to every word that they say. So to me, that was a really extraordinary phenomenon. It was one of the things I liked most about Occupy. Also, there were committees that I thought were really good. I worked with the Solidarity Economy Committee, and we did a lot of education about that. And there were some people who had very good ideas of taking it into the neighborhoods. After it started to decline, there were people who were moving it into places where people were being thrown out of their homes, or they were occupying vacant lots in the neighborhoods. And when we make harsher judgments on Occupy, it's usually about those things just did not continue. But I think the positive part is that people had that experience. And one of the things that we see is that there are all these, not only moments in the dialectical sense, but moments in the temporal sense, in the kairos sense, right? In which an opportunity emerges. And then when people have that formation, that background, that history, that ethos, is still part of them, then more can happen than would have happened if they had not had that experience. This is why I'm so interested in ethos, if you want to talk about that, about the spheres of determination later.
Yeah, I want to back up slightly and ask you these really rudimentary questions, because I will say, I was listening to you, and you're one of the few people I know, you may be the only person who can seamlessly, begin talking about Reclus, and you have moved between an extremely complex dialectical consideration of phenomena as you're at the same time talking about an activist movement, at the same time as you're offering your reflections and experience, and it's really quite unique. It's quite enthralling to listen to you. But I wanted to ask you very specifically, because I know Élisée Reclus has been so important to you, and obviously you've done the translations. He's been, I don't know what your relationship is to him, but I wanted to ask you because there's a passage by him that I always use when I teach, where he talks about looking off the bow of the ship. Yeah. And he's talking. Do you know the passage? He's looking at the foam. Kind of in the wake of the ship, and he's comparing it to kind of just phenomena in general and to civilization. And so to me, he seems very similar to you in some way, his ability to move between these spheres. And I wanted to ask you in a personal sort of way about just your relationship to him, and kind of how you feel about him or how you understand that relationship.
Well, he's one of my great heroes, in part because of his humility, by the way. I really regret not knowing him. I was not born that much later than Élisée Reclus, really, if in geohistory. He died 40 years before I was born, but he could not have lasted that long. But I think he's not that far off historically. I'd gotten interested in anarchism when I was a student in the late 60s, and it took me a while to find out about Élisée Reclus. He's been really neglected in the English-speaking world. He's much better known in the Mediterranean world. And really very little of his work has been translated. Well, let me take that back. A lot of his work has been translated, but it's his geographical work. The New Universal Geography is, well, there are a couple of editions, 16, 17, 18 volumes, huge volumes. So that's been translated. His major, I really think his magnum opus is L'Homme et la Terre, which is Humanity and the Earth, which is 3,500 pages. And really, none of that had been translated until Camille Martin and I translated it for our edition of Reclus. And we translated some of the key chapters, the one on progress, the one on the modern state, one on culture and property, and some other.
What year was that?
It was published from 1905 to 1908.
Your translation, though, what year was that? 90s?
Yeah.
95?
Oh, it was done in the 90s. I don't think it came out until after that. I don't know. I mean, we had an earlier edition with one publisher. Actually, this is probably not what we should talk about. But originally, we were asked to do it by an anarchist publisher who knew that we had started working on the voyage to New Orleans, translating that little text, and I wrote a kind of introduction to Reclus' thought and also his life for that book. And someone whom I met at the Institute for Social Ecology, Pavlos Stavropoulos, started a publishing venture called Aegis Publications, and unfortunately it did not succeed. And we actually had the book laid out and finished. That was in the late 90s. And that fell through. I mean, his project fell through, unfortunately. So then it was published by it's a commercial but academically oriented publisher called Lexington Books, which is really awful. And I'm really glad that we ended up finding PM Press to do it. So it's really had 3 incarnations from the late 90s up until 2013 or something like that. So, Élysée Reclus, why don't you follow up? Because we're kind of going into publishing rather than Élysée Reclus. I admire him so much, is the point. I discovered this text in the Loyola Library had a bound copy of his, it's called Fragments of a Voyage to New Orleans in French. And I read it and I was just totally amazed at the text.
There's a copy of the book down there.
There's a copy there.
I think. Maybe not.
Oh, you took it in the other room. You kept it.
It's one of my favorite artifacts, books, documents. I really just quite love it.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote it when he was. He spent two years in Louisiana. I think he was 23 when he came, 25 when he left.
And why did he come, for those who are not familiar with him?
He came because there was a revolution in France. Well, that was actually a coup d'etat. There was a revolution. He was inspired by that. And there was a coup d'etat. And he and his brother decided to organize the masses. There weren't a lot of masses in the town they lived in, but they tried to get as much masses as possible together and march to the mairie, the city hall. And according to the story, by the time Élysée and Élie got to, that was a crazy slip of the tongue. Élu means elected. Élie, Élie Reclus. When they got to the mairie, they were the only 2 masses left. So they were singled out as these scary revolutionary, like 20-year-old people, and they decided that it was a good idea to disappear from Orthez, where they were at the time, until things had blown over. So Élysée went to England and then Ireland. He worked as a dock worker, did a lot of menial work. He was trying to raise some money to, really go far away. This is when he decided to become a world traveler. And he decided to go to a French-speaking place. which Louisiana still was to a certain extent. So he ended up coming to New Orleans, and he wrote this wonderful text that has 3 parts. One is his trip on the ship through the Antilles, as the islands were called, and then up the delta of the Mississippi River, which is very fascinating. Mm-hmm. He writes about these cane brakes, they're called, they're like bamboo forests, basically. And then he ended up in New Orleans, which he thought was the craziest thing he had ever seen in his life. It was corrupt, weird, bizarre, rowdy. He said he had never come across any place that had more bar rooms per capita than New Orleans. Everybody was crazy and drunk and gambling, and he also said he was like 23 years old. He was not, a really scientific person at the time, so this may not be totally accurate. But he said there was only one more violent place on the face of the earth, which was some frontier town in Nevada, apparently. So, it's just an amazing text. Yeah. So then later on, I discovered the depth of his work and the fact that he had really done the first version of the Earth story. Later I met this thinker named Thomas Berry, who co-authored the Universe story, part of which was the Earth story. And, there were other people who told it in different ways, but he was the person who tried to put the politics, the history, the geography, the, sociology, the history of revolution. It's the Earth story. It's the human story and the Earth story told as the story of freedom and domination, basically. It's the whole history of the Earth expressing itself in the flourishing of all the species, including humanity, and then certain forces of domination emerging which stand in the way of that flourishing. And then, of course, the last part of the story is about the emergence of revolution, the international, which he talks about as the most important thing in human history since the voyages of discovery, in which societies became linked up globally. In a sense, since the beginning of globalization, the international was the next step in which, for the first time, all of the victims of oppression and domination and exploitation decided to join together and change the course of history.
Do you think there's a way in which Reclus kind of offers a creation myth for the West?
A creation myth?
Not a term I terribly like, but something.
No, I'm just wondering what you mean by it, because it's not exactly a creation myth. He begins with the earth, the beginnings of the earth. So, are you talking about that part, like where in a sense, his idea of creation? I mean, it's a very interesting question. I'm interested. In a certain sense, I mentioned this idea of flourishing, and one thing I'm interested in is how in so many cultures, creativity, creation, and birth have been so fundamental, in the earth-affirming cultures. So that in many cultures, they think of the divine as the creator or creative forces, maybe many creative forces in the universe. And in a certain sense, that's different from a creation myth. Often when we hear creation myth, we think of like the monotheistic version, that a certain time, a certain mind, or creative force decided it was all going to happen. And that's one way. I don't know if that's what you meant. That's why I'm not going to just answer it without probing into what you're implying by the question, because the question leads in various directions.
I'll probably let you down in terms of it. If it's that interesting a question, I'm afraid what I'm actually asking may be more rudimentary, but I think something about posing domination as not a cosmic force by any stretch, but as something that really is essential in a way to history, to really kind of foregrounding that. I wonder, one, about that in terms of kind of creating a mythos of the West that is meaningful to many of us. But then I also wonder, and I always preface that I don't claim to understand Hegel, but I know that you're you know a lot about Hegel, and I'm always kind of curious when I read Reclus and when I understand the bit about Hegel I do, to hear you talk a bit about kind of spirit versus domination.
Well, when you asked the question, part of what I was thinking of when I said, well, different people have done it in different ways, one of the people I was thinking about already is Hegel, because he did it in a certain way. So we could relate that. And I think it's very unfortunate that Reclus did not know Hegel, not personally, but didn't know Hegel's work, and was not really influenced by it. I would have liked to have seen what he would do with it. He would have gone in a very different direction with it. It so happens that I just discovered someone else who was a friend of the Reclus brothers, who went to the salon that they had every Monday in Paris, and was a communard. His name was Prat, P-R-A-T, Jules Prat. I assume he said Prat, not Prat, but I don't know where he was from. If he was Alsatian or something, he may have pronounced it T, I don't know. I've never heard of the guy before, but I just found out about him. And it turned out he was the first major Spinozist in France and translated Spinoza's works and was a friend of Reclus and actually helped Reclus when Reclus was imprisoned in, I think, 11 or 13 prisons, and then ultimately he was going to be transported, as they called it, to New Caledonia, which was not a great place to be at that time. But because of the support, including support of Darwin and others who signed petitions, he was sentenced to 10 years exile in Switzerland instead. And apparently Jules Prat helped him move to Switzerland. And it occurred to me, I wish that there had been more cross-fertilization between Spinoza's ideas and Reclus, and also Hegel's ideas and Reclus. And I'm interested in those connections. But in a way, they're both doing something similar.
This is sort of related to, but there's a fantastic question from, I think it's Stephen Duplantier.
Yeah.
Did Reclus have anything to say about the Haitian Revolution? I think a great question.
That's a very interesting question. I know he did, but this is not going to be an exciting answer. I just remember that he wrote, I don't remember what he said. He was, well aware of it. But, one of the problems is that I read 3,500 pages of L'Homme et la Terre, but I read it, over 20 years ago. So it's not in the forefront of my mind at the moment.
Is there a way in which, and Liz, I have so many questions to ask John. They've just got to grab the mic. I apologize. I'm going to give it over to you and back off.
You can grab mics too.
Yeah. We only have 2 mics. We really should have a third. We'll get one. But so one thing I'd like to get into is talking to you a bit about Bookchin, if you're amenable.
Okay, I think there are other things to say about Reclus, but if you'd like to.
No, but that's what I wanted to ask, which is there a way in which Reclus spoke to something or filled something in some way that spoke to what perhaps in Bookchin's philosophy was lacking? Like, was there a corollary, or is that I'm setting something up that's not?
I think it's very unfortunate that Bookchin didn't know anything about Reclus, because, I was in touch with Bookchin when I started working on Reclus. So he mentioned Reclus to me twice. And with Bookchin, you usually didn't take the initiative. He mentioned things, you responded. And the first time he mentioned Reclus, he said he really liked cats. He said, that he heard he really liked cats. And, I didn't really have a lot to say about that, because that was not, Reclus was an animal rights activist, by the way. Reclus was, one of his famous essays was on vegetarianism, which was reprinted a lot. It's in the book, the Reclus. I didn't bring that book, but so, I wasn't totally shocked that he liked cats. I don't know how Murray found out that Reclus liked cats, but he knew that. And then once more, he brought up the subject of Reclus, and he said he really liked cats. I mean, literally, this is the only 2 times he ever said anything, and it was the same thing, that he had heard that Reclus liked cats. And I'm sure I said something about, that I was working on the translation and how interesting he was, but he had no interest in Reclus at all. So,
how did you stumble onto Reclus? Because
I found
archives are in Loyola?
this copy of Voyage to New Orleans in the Loyola Library, a bound copy of it. And I just couldn't believe it. I photocopied it immediately. And so, I showed it to Camille Martin, and we both got very excited about it because she was an anarchist with a Louisiana French background on her father's side. My French background is on my mother's side, but we both identified a lot with the French aspect of things here and the culture. So we both got really excited about Reclus and that translation. We just loved it.
Do you think any members of your family had interacted with Reclus when he was here?
Well, I've thought about that because the city was not very large at the time, although actually in the 1850s it grew a lot. But the French community was not that large. It had been kind of overrun by English speakers in the 1850s. It had a very large British and Irish, and that's how I got my name, because one of the people who came from Ireland had my name, and that person was kind of absorbed on the German side. But the Germans were coming also, but the British and Irish were coming in large numbers. And Reclus wrote about this, and he said that the French speakers were only 10% of the population, and he said that they were going to be overwhelmed soon. He was absolutely right. The Civil War ultimately was, and that's actually after the book I'm working on now, which is on dialectical social ecology. The next book will be about that story of what happened to that culture, because my cousins in France kept 400 pages of letters that were sent from the Louisiana cousins to the French cousins from around the 1840s to the early 1870s, and very heavily concentrated during the period right before and during the Civil War. So they really were recounting the story of the end of French Creole society.
Will that be like a personal history, or will you be looking at it through a kind of broader lens?
It's going to be the story of really the collapse of a culture, because the community, really it's that community, was part of a community that did not come to grips with history. And I mean, it's a complex thing, but it's really about slavery, and it's about the Civil War, and it's about the decline of the city, the destruction, the death, the suffering, and so forth, that came from not realizing, well, partly what was right, but also what was inevitable. So it's going to be the story of the city and the French Creole community in the city, and then the core narrative will be from the 400 pages of letters that I translated a long time ago, so that it'll be told through the writers, who are primarily my great-great-grandmother, whose name was Marie-Victoire Gosselin Lobit, and her sister, who was named Félonise. And they were really good writers. The brothers in the family, the two brothers from the French and Louisiana side, wrote each other, but they wrote very boring business-like letters. And most that survived were from the standpoint of these two women. And so it'll be their voices very heavily telling the story. And then behind it will be the history. And then there's a subtext, which is our crisis today, the social and ecological crisis.
Yeah, it's a great coda to your
Yeah.
to Between Earth and Empire.
And in a way, it's going to be a cautionary tale about what happens to people when they don't face history. And the title of the book is going to be Bitter Heritage, which is part of another subtext, which is that it's going to be a response to the lost cause mythology and the glorification of the Civil War and the Confederacy, because it's a story of death and suffering and loss. And ultimately, my great-great-great-grandfather died during the war when the family had gone to France to visit the cousins to get away from the occupation. And I don't know what happened to him. He was sick. He had lost his elder son, who in a sense was going to be the hope for the future, and his other son had become a prisoner of war. And many other things were going on. It's a very interesting story. I wonder if perhaps he committed suicide. I don't know. He was sick. I mean, this is really an interesting story. It's quite amazing. My great-great-grandfather, who was the prisoner of war, also died fairly young, perhaps partly as a result of the war also. And in these letters, this is my great-great-great-grandmother, wrote about this bitter cup that we have been given to drink. And she increasingly got more religious and was writing about how God was sending them these trials and this test. And one question is to read between the lines and wonder about the extent to which she realized what slavery was and what the war was about, and that perhaps they were being punished for what had happened. Because her sister, Phalanese, who was this single woman, they kind of dismissed her in many ways, but she was a really interesting person.
This was the one left in France that
The one that was her sister, who wrote in Louisiana, who wrote half of the letters, basically. She said she was an abolitionist, which is really extraordinary that this woman with no power and was not really taken seriously. She talked about slavery as the worst scourge on humanity in history. Now she was she was not effectively politicized. I mean, she didn't challenge anything, but at least she realized this. So as a result, I wonder if that had dawned on her, to what extent her sister, in all her feelings about divine punishment, might have been realizing certain things. And ultimately, Marie Victoire, who was called Vic or Victorine, she had a couple of nicknames, she ended up leaving and going to France to live with her husband's family. And she denounced the society. She denounced the politicians for taking them into the war. In New Orleans did not vote for the Civil War. And it was a very close vote, and there was a lot of opposition. Of course, as soon as the army left, everybody fell in line, as always happens. But she was very bitter. I mean, she used the word bitter, this bitter cup and so forth, and that's why I used the word bitter heritage for the title of the book. And, it also is ironically as an attack on, the neo-Confederates who talk about heritage, not hatred. Yeah. And the heritage is hatred. Yeah. And the heritage is death, and it is destruction. So this is what I'm going to do after I finish the next book, assuming I get a chance to do that.
This. What are you going to do with Bayou La Terre in the meantime.
Well, that's the problem.
This actually ties into a really great question that comes to us from Javier Sethis.
Yeah.
Sethnis, sorry, Javier. I'll just read it verbatim. What he's asking is, he writes that in your previous book, The Impossible Community, you expressed the paradoxical concern that if power were to be decentralized in the U.S. tomorrow, we'd probably end up with a number of communities empowering traditionalism, racism, and even fascism. And you called it. The subsequent years since the book's publication have confirmed your fears in one sense, but there also has been much intersectional autonomous resistance.
Wait, could you say that a little slowly?
Sure. What he's asking is, you're saying, when you wrote, is it 2013, The Impossible Community?
I'm guessing.
Okay, around then.
Wait, I said the Reclus book might have been reprinted. I don't know. It's right there.
I think it's 2013 for The Impossible Community, but basically
I think you're
saying
right. The other one may have been earlier. Yeah.
That if we were to decentralize power, we would see resurgent, traditionalism, racism, and fascism. And obviously, in one sense, this has been confirmed. But we've also seen, maybe unexpectedly, this kind of intersectional autonomous resistance surging against the, quote, old ways. So how do you think, it's a big question, how do you think we can construct the anarchist commune of communes while avoiding the reproduction of the capitalist, white supremacist, and heterosexist hells that currently dominate?
Okay. Obviously, 2 books is not enough. I mean, that's a big question. And first, in a certain sense, I don't deserve a lot of credit for the insight that decentralization would mean right-wing power in a lot of places. Particularly since I have a place out at the end of a road full of Confederate flags out in rural Mississippi, and I think a lot about what those people are thinking. And, if they got more power, what they might do. It isn't the whole, it isn't everybody, but there are, a few people with those flags. And, I wonder. Also, I had some friends years ago. Actually, one is French and the other is from New Orleans. It's a couple that came back here from France, and they decided to first move to New Mexico. And it turned out that in spite of the fact that there was a job opportunity there, the county was basically run by right-wing militias. So they ended up going to Tucson in the end. But that if you look at what the militias did, they became very powerful in a lot of local areas. And there's no reason to think that, especially after what we've been through in the last 4 years, that wouldn't happen, and even that there would be more encouragement. They feel more encouraged now probably than they did then. So that part is kind of obvious, but unfortunately, one of the things I believe is that we don't like to look at what's obvious. I have a friend named Alice Santoro, and her pseudonym is Alice B. Obvious. And I share that outlook with her, because what we tend to overlook is often the most obvious. What we tend to repress, what we tend to ignore. So that's an obvious truth that we have to recognize and think more about. But I've tried to write about the preconditions for making some progress. And that's why I write about, and one of the things I want to do with the dialectical social ecology group, if we can really get down to work in it, and and look at different themes and different areas of inquiry that we need to progress in. How do things happen, and how do things not happen? How does what exists come to exist? How could it possibly change?
But it's so striking to me that you're one of the only philosophers. There are others, but you're one of the only philosophers working today who is, almost in a shamanic kind of way, straddling these two realities of thinking at a dialectic level.
I'm not quite that pessimistic. I think they're,
Well, okay.
I want to work with some of these people. So
I can qualify that. I can qualify that maybe by simply saying I'm always so inspired by you as a model for the possibility that we can seriously, whether or not we are dialecticians, whether or not we're other kinds of theorists, that we can actually truly find a way to unite our practices vis-a-vis organizing prefigurative communities and politics with these like very rigorous philosophical inquiries.
Right.
And maybe that's a good time to ask you to say a bit more about the dialectical social ecology group.
Or maybe answer your question better, since I really didn't. What do you think?
Well, your book has such a strong belief in the power of regionalism and reconnecting people with the earth and the positivity that will come from that. And so hearing you acknowledge the potential for divisiveness about giving regionality more autonomy, I thought it would be interesting to hear you talk about sort of your faith and belief in people, because it's a theme throughout the book, and I think this is a nice point, right? You can't shape people in the way that you hope. If you offer them autonomy, you have to let them come there. And I wonder if you do believe, what you extrapolate might happen if we return to that kind of regionalism, which would also allow this.
I think the question is not whether bad things would happen, but whether good things will happen. What can we do to make good things happen? And we don't know what the possibilities are for change. By the way, the thing I was going to say, following up about tying in with Occupy, things have, millions of people participate in one way or another in Occupy. Something happened to them. They have that within them. One of the things I think we have to talk about with dialectical social ecology is trans-individuality and things that are going on below the surface, emotionally, affectively, and so forth. On the way here, I was listening to, I'll admit, an NPR kind of program, and I'm forgetting the name of it. It's a series that's on, and it was talking about really the revolutionary change that's taken place in some areas in the last 15 or 20 years. In particular, the host of this show was talking about the fact that, I'm not sure what the year was, but 10 years ago, 15, 20, 6% of the people in the United States approved of gay marriage. 68% do now. Okay, and he couldn't, in fact, some of the experts that he talked to could not think of any other examples of that kind of transformation in values. And there were some beautiful things on the show about, on the personal level of transformation. We don't know what can happen. And we don't know how one thing can lead to another. In fact, I think we could spend a lot of time, for instance, analyzing why that happened and how something goes from a recognition of something on the social level that then leads to a recognition of something on the personal experiential level.
Can I ask a quick follow-up, which is, this is a kind of a thank you in a way, which is an anecdote that right around the time that Me Too first sort of began in sort of 2017 maybe, I came to visit you, and I was all kind of frazzled in some sense with all the problems with, what this meant and et cetera, and you and I were driving, and you just cut to the chase and said, look, I think young people are talking about consent, and that's good. And it was a kind of optimism. I've thought back to this a number of times where I think sometimes you have this ability. You have a very deep well of optimism, in addition to other things.
Well, right, if we don't look at those things, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, but it's really inspiring to me. It really means a lot to me that you never seem to lose. I mean, hope is a very treacherous thing, and I have a question about Buddhism coming up, so I want to be careful, but it's interesting to me that you are very hopeful.
Well, I just did a podcast called, it was a series called Green Dreamers, and the host of the podcast asks three questions at the end, and one is, what gives you hope? And so I had to think about that. She told me ahead of time what the three questions would be. And after we've had our discussion, this is very brief, you get a sentence or two. And I've thought about this before, and I know what it is. It's being around people who are joyful, caring, hopeful. When you're with people who are like that, doing something, it allows you to persevere, and it renews you. That's one reason why the last year has been so difficult. I mean, basically, I have been in a house. Fortunately, I go to Bayou La Terre on the weekend and see human beings. But for most of the last year, most of every week, I spend inside, away from people. And fortunately, we've had some really great discussion groups going on. I was resistant, to Zoom and so forth, and I was resistant to the idea of doing courses and classes and so forth online. I accept it a lot more now, but I still think that the personal dimension is so important. But a long time ago, I realized, I'll tell you who they are. Even I think people deserve credit, when they're good people. In New Orleans, there are people who were associated with the Catholic social justice group Pax Christi, and many of them have a background with the Catholic worker movement, which in many ways is one of the most practical anarchistic movements. I mean, they actually create houses and live together, and they're focused not on their own lifestyle kind of things. They're focused on serving the community, and they're happy. And they're very caring. I mean, they had a politics of care going a long time ago. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that we need, an ethics of care, but also a politics of care, and an ethics of flourishing, and also a politics of flourishing. So when we're in the midst of caring and flourishing, we tend to be optimistic about the world.
Beautiful. I mean, you sound kind of Spinozian to me.
Well, I think we need to study Spinoza a lot.
Is that something you've thought more about in recent years?
Well, I've thought of Spinoza for many, many years. I mean, when I was teaching at Loyola, we always discussed Spinoza, and I always thought there was a lot of common sense and good advice in Spinoza.
Yeah.
I always thought, he had this idea of, you can debate exactly how to interpret all these things, but he was against a certain type of teleology, that everything has a certain type of meaning. Well, one of the evil aspects of that is when bad things happen to you, you get the feeling you're a bad person. Well, Spinoza was great on that. Sometimes bad things happen because something occurs in nature. What I think of in New Orleans is if a big tree falls on your house, you could think of it as, God is punishing you, or, you're living in the subtropics where we have hurricanes a lot. Go somewhere else if you don't want trees falling. So Spinoza is wonderful on that. I mean, a lot of people, this determinist, and of course he was anathema to so many people. He was this weird pantheistic determinist, or maybe he was an atheist, nobody really knows. There are other questions about him. But I think he's one of the great inspirations in so many ways, and also politically.
I'd love to dialogue with you more about that at another time. But
we should study Spinoza.
I am right now. I'm really enjoying quite a bit. John Protevi at LSU is writing a lot about him, and I'm learning a lot from that. But it also leads to another question, which is shame. I mean, you just implied shame, right? That when bad things happen to us. And this, to me, is one of the big social control mechanisms, right? I mean, this is really important stuff. Shame is so limiting. And so I want to ask you, kind of making a detour about being a father. I obviously, as you know, have a 7-year-old who adores you, is very excited to see you today. And one of the most important things to me is I want to make sure I don't shame him. I want to make sure that I always make clear to him that who he is separate from what he does in some way, right? Mm-hmm. That he cannot be bad by doing a bad thing. Right. But I wonder both about your experience of being a father, and you have multiple kids, and sort of how... I don't even know how many kids you have, I should say.
We all have multiple personalities.
Yeah. But I wonder then about your politics, and sort of how they played out in your parenting, if they did, and if that was a vehicle that affected your thought or not. And if it's something you don't want to talk about, that's fine.
Well, I mean, there's some things I would prefer to talk about, and other things I wouldn't. And there are complexities, and then also there are complexities in that families go through a lot, and you go through various stages, for instance, divorces and kids being split between parents and so forth. So, and then not being split anymore. In the case of my kids, they all ended up with me again. Being a single parent has had a huge influence on me. I mean, part of the time I wasn't, part of the time I was. And when my kids were very young, they had a huge impact on my political development because, they tied in with it so much, because in the 70s, when my kids were young, we got involved in the cooperative movement very heavily. And my two older kids were in a co-op preschool, and I worked in the school once a week because you worked one day every 2 weeks per child. So I was pretty busy with both teaching and going to graduate school Monday through Thursday, and then I taught in the co-op on Friday, and their mother was teaching every morning in another cooperative preschool. And then I was coordinating a little buying club, we called it a food co-op. It was really a very small scale buying club kind of thing. So there were 3 co-ops right at the center of our life. And we really, by the way, the food co-op was so important to us because we were very, very poor. And we could spend a lot of time talking about how important those co-ops were. And I actually organized during the summer another child care co-op for when the kids were off from the year round, except for a month in the summer or something like that. We just automatically started thinking in terms of doing things as a co-op, and that the kids were in a cooperative situation, which was democratically run. The one that the 2 kids were in had maybe 50 families. It was a good-sized co-op with, I think.
Is that in New Orleans?
Yeah, it was called the University. One was called the Front Yard Co-op, and the other was something with university. It was the university area co-op. They were both very close, and the food co-op was right there too. So that was very important. And then the kids ended up going to alternative schools, a Montessori school, an open classroom school, and a New Orleans free school. So that was very important. And then later, it was primarily through one of my kids that I got really interested in therapeutic communities, which has had a huge impact on me. Much later in life, I actually became a single parent much later than I had expected to be, and I just learned so much from that experience, and also from groups like AA, Al-Anon, and also therapeutic communities. And I ended up, when I did the Impossible Community, someone who had really grown up in a therapeutic community that his father co-founded told me about it, and you know about this. I went to England and visited, and also went to the conference of therapeutic communities, and you, Matt, visited when I gave a talk at that conference. And the community, it's a religious community in Deal, England, taught me so much. It's a large community. It's not a residential community. It's had from 100 to 200 people in it. And I learned so much about what people need. And one of the members, the person who had grown up in the community basically, came to New Orleans, and he told me, what we're doing is what you wrote about in your book, The Impossible Community. And as a result of that, I went to visit, And I found out a lot of things that I didn't know when I wrote the book, The Impossible Community, that a lot of things made more sense to me after seeing a lot of their practice.
One of the, I was very fortunate to attend that conference through John and learned a lot, and it's influenced me ongoing. One of the people who was, I don't remember his title, but he was very involved in the movement at this time, and he one afternoon told me quite a bit about working with shell-shocked vets in this kind of unconventional, almost Artie Lang kind of way, where he took shell-shocked vets and he had them live together and just sleep together and eat together in a very communal way. And at some point, without any formal therapy, they would just be kind of better, and it would be time to go. And I found it this really profound case for the fact that care and connection is so fundamentally curative.
Yes,
It's closely related to your project.
Yeah, but let me talk about their project a little briefly, because I did learn so much, and I attended their community meetings, their big meetings. I had a lot of sessions one-on-one with people in the community, or a couple of them. And I had this one meeting with, I would say, 5 or 6 women who had been members of the community for a long time, and they basically told me their life stories. We spent an afternoon sitting in somebody's backyard. I remember a beautiful spring day, and they told me their very sad life stories, that they had all been through terrible abuse, and that they had been rejected. And it is a religious community, and a lot of them talked about how their religious communities had been so terrible to them, and that they had been given ideas that, God was punishing them, and they were cursed, and they were shunned by others. In many cases, it was spousal abuse, and it was within the family. It was very severe. And they talked about having breakdowns and being alienated from everyone. And at the end of that afternoon, I decided that if I had any project to work on, I would want to work on it with 5 people like that. That they were so developed and evolved as human beings, that those are the kind of people I would want to work with as human beings. And another thing that struck me about the community is hearing about how people join the community. And basically, it was people. One thing they asked people to try to rent or buy houses where they had an extra bedroom, so that whenever people moved there, because they had heard about the community, they would be able to live with members of the community for a while until they got established, got a job, got on their feet, became integrated into the community. I mean, when you think of the gap between this and what most of the people we work with politically do, and they think is political work, it's on a different level. So another thing that they told me is about how people ended up coming there. And the way they would come there is they had a friend in, say, London, who was basically hopeless, who just, nothing worked for this person, and they're very, basically they were sad about their friend. And then their friend disappeared for a while, for a month or 2 months or 6 months. And let's say after 6 months, the friend appeared again, and the friend was like a different person. Their friend was capable, happy, working on very good things, talking about their life. And they thought, what happened to this person? And some of those people thought, I would like that to happen to me. So, this is really my model for what we need to begin for social transformation and become more, we discussed a book called Being Numerous, I think it was, to become more numerous. And at the end of Occupy, I remember, I think I went to like 50 General Assembly meetings of Occupy. It was some number like that. It was for quite a while I went. I don't think it was 100. I wasn't that masochistic. I think it was 50.
50 is quite a lot.
It's a lot. And the last 10 or so were not good. And a lot of times I've thought about this. When I was in a meeting, a political meeting, I've thought, if the people we would like to reach out to could see us right now, would they want to be part of what we are? And, the answer was usually no. And this is why the Rastafarians inspire me. I had a friend, she's a friend, she was one of my students a long time ago. She went to India and then became a volunteer in India, and she's a great poet, Erin Lear, you should get her book. But she ended up going to Guyana and doing a master's thesis on Rastafarian culture, and she was very critical of aspects of Rastafarian culture, but there's a lot to learn from the Rastafarians. And, one of the things, I love the music, of course, and there's Rivers of Babylon and so forth. With knowing it's Babylon, just knowing it's Babylon helps a lot, and really knowing that that's where you are. I mean, even if you're not as bad off as the worst victims of Babylon, it's still Babylon wherever you are in that system. And with the Old Testament line about the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart, may they be acceptable. Well, it might not be Jah, whatever it is. If it's the community, if it's the Weltgeist, whatever it is, if we think that way, that there's something larger. This is, we studied Gustav Landauer a little. And for Gustav Landauer, it was Geist. Also, it wasn't only Hegel. In a certain sense, Gustav Landauer really didn't like Hegel, but there's a real overlap there. So whether we think of it as spirit or Jah or whatever it might be, that there's something we're in touch with, and that when we speak, we think, is it acceptable in this larger context? And that makes a big difference.
We have all these great questions that I'm nervous to get to, but I'm wondering, are you spiritual?
That's a bizarre question.
Well, I ask it.
There are all these wonderful joke definitions of the difference between being religious and being spiritual. And, the classic one, you know what the classic one is?
Religious, not spiritual from AA? No.
No, religious people don't want to go to hell. Spiritual people have already been there.
That's good. Well, but I mean it in terms of your engagement with Taoism, your engagement with Buddhism, your engagement with various forms of Christianity is very striking to me. And it's always an engagement that in some way you're a little bit of an outsider to in one regard, but it's also a very deep engagement. And so I've always wondered kind of how you...
Well, I have a friend who wrote a great book on that called History and Spirit. His name is Joel Covell. And, in the end, he had a mystical experience. This is, okay, I'll tell you about Joel, who was one of my best friends. I really miss Joel so much. He came from a secular Jewish background, New York, Northeastern, ended up as a leftist intellectual. But he went to Yale. And the first day or so when he was at Yale, they did same thing that I went through at Tulane. They put you in a big auditorium, and the thing I remember is they usually tell you something like that: look to the right and look to the left. One of you three people that is not going to be here, this is really a good school. You have to work hard or else you're not going to make it. And then they have people who do inspiring talks, at the beginning when you're a freshman. So they ask some religious guy, some theologian or somebody, to give a talk. And I would love to know what he said, because Joel said that he had a mystical experience listening to the words of this person. Now, Joel was a Blakean, and I have a feeling he had already read a lot of Blake, probably. Very erudite person also. He probably already had his Blakean background, but whatever this person said led to this experience, which conditioned the rest of his life. And then in, this is like 40 years ago, he went to Nicaragua during the revolution, and he came in contact with the base communities, in which spirituality meant something, it was a spirituality of liberation. And he was tempted to join the church, but he said he couldn't really because of like the way the church had treated Jews and the Inquisition and all of this. I mean, he thought there were some nice things about it, but he just wasn't the right community for him. But then finally, a few years before he died, maybe 5 years or so, he met this Episcopal priest who had a church in Harlem. It was primarily African-American church, and they basically had liberation theology, and they had a community, a social justice community that for him was like the base communities. And I remember seeing him at the Left Forum. I probably told you this story already, probably recently even, because it was just so moving to me. He told me, he said, well, first, he was so happy. I mean, this is not typical. I was among all these left-wing intellectuals, and, everybody doesn't go around being really happy. And Joel was so happy. So I was wondering, like, what's going on with Joel? And, of course, my first thought was, I hope he's not on some drug. I hope it's not medication that's doing this. So he said, let's go out and have a drink. I want to talk to you. And we went to this place and had a beer. And he told me about finding this community. And he said, well, I want you to know, it isn't that I discovered this like a big man in the sky. It isn't that. But in a sense, he discovered that spirit was there. And before that, he had written this beautiful book, History and Spirit, which is one of the deepest investigations of all the different meanings of spirit. And I mean, he's not any kind of Orthodox Hegelian either, but of course there's that whole tradition that's so important. And there's that Joachimite tradition in Christianity, of the three ages of the world, which is, the age of the Father, which is the law, and the age of the Son, which is revelation. The age of the Holy Spirit, it's the community of love, in which the divine and spirit is incarnated, if you want to use that kind of language, in the community. And that's what he found. And that's what Gustav Landau wrote about, who also was a Jew. And I think, there's that Jewish messianic tradition that's so important. In a certain sense, that's something that I still, I'm not Jewish, at least not that I know of. But, I think he was in some ways touched by that Jewish messianic tradition, and I think that's the good side of Bookchin that I found more in his earlier work before he rediscovered the Enlightenment in a very weird way and became increasingly irrational on behalf of reason, and narrowed down his conception of reason to make it a kind of sectarian kind of thing. And just became very rigid and not able to even understand what other people were saying. But there was that aspect of his work also. But Joel's book is so wonderful, History and Spirit.
We'll post a link to it. There's a question from D. Kime. I don't know who this is, but they're an old friend of yours.
Yeah,
is
from
it David?
the Institute for Social Ecology.
Okay.
Very good, great person.
But I wanted to make sure we got to it, which is, hello to my old friend John. I wonder what Murray would have thought of the current developments of, quote, liberatory technology as we are seeing them currently develop in society. Wind energy in the Southwest power pool that I use is currently powering over 60% of the grid that is allowing this communication.
You know, you talk so fast. One of the things is, you told me I jumped from one thing to the other and all that, but I'm from New Orleans.
Yeah.
People talk so slowly.
Yeah. I'm from D.C. I talk like
Yeah,
rapid fire.
sometimes you talk so fast I can't follow exactly what you're saying.
Well, the question is, he's saying that he wonders what Murray would have thought about the current developments of liberatory technology. So, for instance, wind energy, which he's using in the Southwest power pool,
Right.
is powering over 60% of the grid. And so he's asking what...
Yeah, I mean, I really can't answer because for one thing, he evolved a lot. And he changed his, he tended not to focus a lot on how he changed his views, but like his views of indigenous people, which I found inspiring in his early works, like in The Ecology of Freedom. He has some really beautiful passages. But then later on, he kind of gloated. Like I remember when he found out that sort of some of what he thought of as wreaking havoc that indigenous people did in North America and other places, he kind of thought, like he was satisfied that because he reacted so much against people he thought as like neo-primitivists and anti-civilization people and so forth, that he was very reactive, which is very non-dialectical. That it is what it isn't, it is what it is to some degree also. It both is not, both is not, and either is nor is not. I mean, that's really the dialectical view. You have to look at all of those aspects. So I can't really answer what he would have said if he had continued to evolve, but those interests were not quite as great in his later days. So I'm not sure to what extent he would have had so intense an interest. I really can't say. I'm not competent to answer that question.
One thing I wanted to hear you talk about was your kind of history of the imagination, and I think a lot of the themes that you've talked about, right, especially returning to Occupy, you can think of it in terms of successes of the imaginary, the social imaginary,
Right.
So I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, well, in those two books that you have right there, I talk about these spheres of social determination, which are the social institutional sphere, the social imaginary, the social ideology, and the social ethos. And I think it's important to look at all of them. And certainly the imaginary, I've kind of shifted in the direction of focusing on ethos a lot more, and the emotive and affective dimensions. And you can't separate them, by the way, because while you're imagining, you're having all sorts of feelings and emotions. And we could use all kinds of language of cathecting and investment and all of that with the
What shaped your turn towards ethos?
Experience and also learning about things, direct experience and learning about things, and also looking. One of the things, I've written some texts on where we could go with dialectical social ecology, and part of it is looking into neuroscience, ideas like neuroplasticity, enactivism, some of these things that are so important. There's just a lot to learn. And some of it is about the imaginary, but a lot of it fits more in with the ethos and how groups of people sort of evolve and develop collectively, and there are things going on between us that we often don't recognize. So all of these are important, but one of the things we haven't talked about was the first question, I think it was, which is about writing. And, one of the things that if you look at the books down there, two of those books on the floor have a different name, Max Caffard.
Oh.
And,
I was waiting that. I was going to ask about Max.
well, it relates.
Yeah,
You'll
who
have
is
to ask Max.
And what does his name really mean?
Okay, well, that's part of, so it took me many years to begin to figure out who Max Caffard was. I mean, after like 20 years of working on what Max Caffard's name meant, I started working on what John Clark meant. And I've discovered all sorts of things about that. And in fact, in the book Lightning Storm Mind, and if I say I, it doesn't mean one or the other. I don't believe in personal identity. I don't believe in an integrated self. Matt wanted to talk about Buddhist philosophy, and one of the things that you learn in Buddhist philosophy, and the reason why it's radically dialectical, is that everything consists of aggregates. Everything consists of skandhas, these elements that come together, all of reality is these flows, we could say, of energy, of nature, and they converge in certain ways and then they separate. And we're not aware, we have a certain consciousness that partially becomes self-consciousness, and a self is more or less defined. And therefore, certain elements of experience or elements of what is converging and diverging come to awareness in the midst of that convergence and divergence. And it would be very naive to think that we really are some identical, self-identical being. In Buddhist philosophy, there's the idea that there are the three marks of existence, one of which is suffering, dukkha, which is so important because it's our problem to solve. It's the reason why we inflict so much suffering on other people, and it's also our wake-up call. And then the other two marks of existence are impermanence of everything and anatta or anatman, which is no self, which means not only no self-identity of beings like us that tend to think we have a self-identity, but also no self-identity of beings that don't have a consciousness of self, but we kind of impose a self-identity on them. And I happen to think that is ontologically correct, and that I believe one aspect of dialectic, and dialectic is so hated generally because it's associated with a kind of dogmatism, just like there's a famous book on Dalviez, I think is the name of the author. I think it's a 2-volume work on psychoanalysis and the doctrine of Freud. Well, you could write a book on dialectical philosophy and the doctrine of Hegel, or you could write a book on dialectical philosophy and the doctrine of Marx, but you don't want to confuse the doctrine of Hegel or the doctrine of Marx or the non-doctrine of Adorno or whatever it might be with dialectical thinking or dialectic. I don't like to say dialectics, by the way, because it sounds like physics or electronics or something like that. It sounds like some field of study. And I realize people are going to use the word dialectics, but I don't do it because of that reason, because it makes it sound like some systematic study of something rather than basically a demolition of every systematic field of study of everything, because it shows how nothing can ultimately be pinned down, which doesn't mean that you can't pursue truth and discover a lot about nature, about reality.
I've always appreciated your careful attention to words, and I wonder if there are some Sephardian words that Clark would never use, or
well, there are. But yes, definitely. I've tried to keep them separate to a certain extent, and actually, because John Clark is kind of a joke to Max Caffard, because he knows
How did they meet?
It's around 1988. You see that I know a lot more about this than the other persona, because the other one has these murky origins way back. But around 1988, the name emerged, and it was not calculated. It just emerged. And that there were certain sort of gestures, like ideas and like funny ideas and kind of crazy ideas that were emerging at the same time as the name. So it became a kind of project. but it didn't become a project in the sense like writing the book Bitter Heritage as a project. It became more of a project of being a certain way under certain circumstances, like certain times being one way, but I already knew about being that, because that's what life is like. Depending on what you are like, you have to do that more or less. But everybody has to do it. And, you know, and this is, you know, Lacan, by the way, to speak a language, we have to do this. Lacan went so far as to call it symbolic castration. You know, that whatever you are, society is going to try to take it away from you. And that's true. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the best word for it, because it kind of pushes it in one direction while it goes in many different directions. But I wrote something to a friend of mine who had moved to Florida, and I made this crazy comment, and I never heard from him again, ever. But I don't think he knew that it was me. And that kind of surprised me, because I then realized that when I do things like that, sometimes people don't think of it as really being me. And I mean, he had moved away, we weren't in touch anymore, so I didn't really have to pursue it. But a few years after that, there was this magazine called Organica, and in fact, the picture of Max Caffard is the picture that was done for Organica magazine when the editor really wasn't sure who these two personae were. And he had an artist do a picture of what I looked like at that time, but half of it was from like a Polynesian or Melanesian mask. So it's these two kind of combination of what I kind of looked like at that time, but not like that either. So I kind of decided maybe that should be the picture of Max Caffard, because it is what it isn't in a double sense. Because I didn't even look like anymore like what I looked at like at that time, and also I didn't really look like the mask at all. So then I sent him some writings, that some of which were published as John Clark and some were published as Max Caffard, and he called me up and he said, "Thanks for sending me this stuff, really interesting." He said, "You and Max Caffard agree on a number of things." And I thought, this is amazing. I mean, I've succeeded enough, like in doing things in different ways, neither of which is more me than the other at all. And in a certain sense, the Max Caffard thing is much more me, you know, like in a stronger sense than that other persona. Because in a certain sense, part of it was just generalized reaction to repression, but part of it was going through the crisis of finding out what was happening to like orthodox social ecology and be so related to it, and then seeing this split developed in which people that I really admired were being attacked and parodied and misrepresented and lied about and all of this. So I was really committed to something at the same time that I was realizing in horror that it was kind of evolving in a really bad way. But I was still very committed to it. So in a certain sense, it was a crisis that required a split so that I could do more Dadaist, surrealist, Taoist kind of things while also like writing stupid mechanistic rehashes of social ecology ideas that I really needed to get behind but didn't realize it yet. So in this book, Lightning Storm Mind, which is the only book that I've ever done that really uses the methodology that I kind of discovered or ran into, it's the only one that is written in accord with like the way things are or are not. And at the end of Lightning Storm Mind, I wrote this text called On Anarchography, which is like anarchist biography, in which I wrote about this, but I also wrote about it as I wrote about different a different persona is in it also. Like I talk about one and the other, and even a third. And there are more than that, actually. I have my favorite pseudonym isn't any of those, but I've hardly done anything. You'll see something eventually. It's radically different from any of these others.
Steve Bannon, is that it?
Yes, he's my puppet. I'm behind it all. But what I was getting at is, so I didn't use, in Surregionalist Manifesto stuff, I wrote about this crisis that we had in Scotland at a castle. And I wrote about C as the persona instead of my name. But then I made up this other persona called Johannes Clericus for the anarchography, because first it's a kind of détournement of Kierkegaard, and also it's this clericus, which is Latin, and it was kind of making fun of my so-called self as being academic and using Latin, and it was just opened up the possibility for a kind of so-called self-satire by Max Caffard doing this, which I really liked.
I think
this is dialectic, by the way.
It's interesting because when you were speaking of the People's Mic earlier, I was kind of thinking about mimesis, and kind of what that is, and sort of how we mimic or internalize, and then when you talk about this kind of splitting of the self, it's kind of like an anarchy of the subject.
It isn't exactly splitting, though. It's because all those things are there.
Right, but splitting into
and then
streams.
They're allowed to flow out,
right.
Express themselves.
But it's interesting because there's a question I really want to ask here that someone sent. It's a two-parter that has to do with Buddhism and Freud. But I think it's interesting because there is this kind of other model, kind of subaltern model of subjectivity, which I think is coming back with affect theory, that has to do with notion that we kind of have multiple flows of identity within our subjectivity, and it's sort of interesting to listen to you and hear you're kind of describing some of that. But I want to read this question, which is relating to Between Earth and Empire, which says, in Buddhism, what would you say is the difference between everyday desire and unacceptable craving? How do we know the difference?
You mean everyday craving and
Yeah. So how do we know the difference? And do you think that Freud was right or wrong to interpret the desire for nirvana as an unconscious death wish? And then the second part of that is, what is non-attached compassion? I would think compassion presumes an attachment bond between self and other.
The person wrote,
So it's the same person writing kind of two questions I think are related. But really the first one is, what's the difference for you as you write about between everyday desire and craving?
I mean, first, the term everyday desire is really interesting to begin with. It challenges me to think of what everyday desire is, because desire is so specific and so complex. So, that's one thing to think about. And now in the Buddhist texts, we have this problem of Trishna, Tanha. We have these words in Pali and Sanskrit. And the question is how to translate any of this, especially if you don't know the languages. You can read a lot of people who do, and you can look at the arguments for doing it one way or another. And I think there's been a big misunderstanding if it's ever translated as desire, because the more technical literature, I think, would use something else almost always. And sometimes even like the word thirst is used. Not that it's not generic enough, but it gives people a hint of what it's about. But craving is another term that's often used. And this is something that I have to keep thinking about. I mean, I can tell you what I've come up with so far. And I want to keep studying this. But often I don't like to say, okay, so the three poisons are another thing that's important in Buddhism. And greed, hatred, and ignorance, they're usually translated as. And certainly greed is very similar to this concept of craving. But I like to talk about, this sounds a little too tame, but like unhealthy desires and unhealthy, let's not say unhealthy, that's not what I usually say anyway. It's destructive desires and destructive aversions. I think conveys a lot. In a practical sense. And then also with ignorance, I think something that a lot of when you look into Buddhist analyses of things, I think mental confusion conveys a lot, because that could mean different things. It could mean literally being confused or just having the wrong idea because you're not aware of something. But there are all kinds of downfalls in that area. And the word ignorance, it sounds a little too intellectual, like it has to be that you just don't know something you're supposed to know. But there's that whole realm. And of course, when you get into mental confusion, you can get into ideology and so forth, false consciousness. But then with destructive aversions, hatred is part of that, but it leads you to think about a lot more things than just what we normally call hatred. And if you think of destructive desires, it would include what we might immediately think of as craving, but it would also include a number of other things. So I've thought with those more general descriptions of the three poisons, it might be more useful, like if you're doing analysis of your life, like how to solve a problem, or a group of people, figuring out what's going on in the group that they have to work on. So that would be a beginning of what I would think about. I would say, rather than ordinary desires, I would say, what about like non-destructive desires? What about constructive desires? What about really great desires? There are a lot of desires that aren't destructive.
Well, is there a relationship, and there may not be at all, it may be semantic, but between, you describe dialectic as demolishing totality, and then we talk about destructive desire. And so demolishing and destructive, how do we differentiate those, or how do you differentiate those?
Wait, I said destructive desires. What did I say about demolishing?
In talking about dialectic, you were sort of saying dialectic is ultimately about demolishing totality. Is that demolishing everything? Oh, well, everything isn't exact. I wasn't really. Let's narrow it down a little. If it sounded like every. Right. So this is one thing that I find in common between, I shouldn't say necessarily in common, because Nagarjuna, however you want to say it, a lot of people in philosophy say Nagarjuna, others say, I think in India they say Nagarjuna. And there's a famous actor with that name, so if you do a search, he'll come up instead of the philosophy. So there's a lot of dialectic in the Indian tradition, and particularly the Nagarjuna's dialectic in many ways is the most radical. But then there's also the Hegelian, Marxian, Frankfurt School, and so forth. And one of the things you find in these traditions is an anti-essentialism, anti-substantialism, which, is very fundamental to Buddhism. Svabhava, the absence of self-being or self-existence. A lot of people have trouble with the concept of emptiness. Once I went to there was a philosophy conference at Loyola of really dedicated philosophers. It was the Sartre Circle, and it was all these Sartrean experts. And I had a conversation with a graduate student, and Sartre was really interested in dialectic and all of that.
And we got on the subject of the connection of this stuff with Asian philosophy and this concept of emptiness. And he just kind of dismissed it, emptiness. What is all this stuff about emptiness? And I said, it's really important that if you say that something is empty, you should ask the question, empty of what? And most people, when they hear it, and then they have this, I think, this horrible concept, the void. I just hate to hear about the void. I mean, not that there are times when you can talk about the void, but in this context, it's so, sounds like some kind of ersatz mysticism, I want to be one with the void or something like that. I mean, you can't be one with emptiness. And, Chandrakirti wrote this with the emptiness of emptiness. Emptiness is empty. Chandrakirti, another one of these people in this tradition, one of the big figures. The emptiness of emptiness. But I mean, all of these, that whole tradition, Tsongkhapa and all those people, the emptiness is empty. And you can't say it's not a physical image like a vacuum or something, in which the vacuum is vacuumed or something. I mean, it makes no sense. You're on different levels. It means empty of inherent existence, which really means, it's an anti-substantialist, anti-identity theory kind of approach, anti-essentialist kind of approach.
That's what I was going to say, though, that people tend to confuse emptiness with anti-essentialism. In the sort of philosophical sense. But it is
an anti-essentialism.
In a sense,
That's
absolutely.
part of it.
But it's not synonymous with the kind of post-structural anti-essentialism.
Well, post-structuralism is very recent. I mean, this has thousands of years of history. So, I mean, obviously they didn't copy it off some recent.
No, what I mean to say is that I've seen people kind of jump from, anti-essent, that must be what emptiness means. They kind of achieve a conceptuality of it, by sort of referring to anti-essentialism. But I just realized we only have 10 minutes left. This has flown by so quickly. I want to make sure that we have a chance to, both for you if there's more, but to ask you, John, what you're working on, what about the status of La Terre, how people can get involved at La Terre.
Okay.
Really how people can get involved at La Terre and what La Terre needs and what you want it to be, and to sort of plant that seed for whoever may see this.
Okay, plant a seed.
I actually think that it's really nice to pull through from your interest in intentional communities, because that's how you introduce the concept of La Terre to me, and you write so much about this in the book and the need for care, and so.
Right. So, the seed is a great symbol. Vandana Shiva says, in the book, The Impossible Community, I have a lot on the Sarvodaya movement, and which originally was the Gandhian so-called movement, and then later a very important movement in Sri Lanka. And the spinning wheel was the symbol, and she says maybe the seed should be the symbol of the same kind of movement today. There are a lot of things that can be said about that. What I'm working on in La Terre. So La Terre is this place which is on Bayou La Terre. And La Terre also means the earth, which is our home planet. And La Terre really also means the earth on which we walk. And I think it's Hakuin's Song of Zen. He says, this very ground on which we walk is the pure lotus land. So it's like heaven. It's the earth. And we have an indigenous group that has a sweat lodge, they actually do believe that the earth is sacred, and they're practicing sacred ceremonies on the earth at La Terre, at Bayou La Terre, on the planet Earth, La Terre. And I hope that we can start doing things together there in person. We have an increasing number of buildings where we can have people stay, and we can have meetings, and we have lots of good camp spots. And we do have two groups that meet through Zoom, the Dialectical Social Ecology group and the APE group. anarchist political ecology. And right now I'm working on a book on dialectical social ecology that I basically kind of wrote 20 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and I'm grateful that I never published any of it because I needed to think and rethink things so many times. And I think I'm getting near to maybe making enough progress with it, and I'd like to do that this year, finish up this book. And I want to work with people who are interested in the theory of dialectical social ecology, which is also a theory of practice, and it's about what we've talked about. We began to talk about analyzing the world, the imaginary, the ethos, the ideology, the institutions, and also other big things like the realm of production and the realm of consumption, and how in a certain sense modernity and so-called post-modernity really relate to the productionist and consumptionist stages of capitalism, and how we have to understand the institutions and processes in society in relation to that evolution. So all that's part of the theory, and I want to work with people who are interested in it and who would really like to grapple with the questions and some of the other things that we've mentioned about psychology and other fields that are revealing a lot to us about ourselves.
I have two questions. One, I don't like the phrase, I've never liked the phrase layman's terms, but for lack of a better word, one, what is dialectical social ecology to someone who's never heard any of those phrases and has no context? And then second, what would you picture, desire, in 50 years, assuming that you have not lived to be the oldest man in the world, what do you want Lothair to be?
First, what was it that you didn't like?
Well, I think you should explain.
In layman's terms, you know what I don't like? For lack of a better term, I hate that. Because I always think, whenever anybody says that, how much have you really tried to come up with a better term? That's dialectics, by the way. But I really do think about that all the time. I think about every time somebody says that, I think, well, could there be a better term? Why don't we just stop now and think about a better term? Because when I write, I always think, and then I look at the thesaurus sometimes, and I just meditate on it, and I think, we really don't have a word for that. And we really need to come up with a word for it. But I can't answer the question of what 50 years from now.
But I think you should explain what Lothair is, and that it, as I understand Lothair, it's the place where you're putting into practice all these ideas that you write about, and it's this land you have, and because I think we've never really said what exactly happens at Bayou Lothair.
Right.
Besides Sweat Lodge and how it's the place where you.
All right. So just to be clear about this, there's a place that's now called the Bayou Lothair Woodland Center, which is going to be doing various things, including like renting space to other people to use, and I hope generating funds in order to do programs and doing more building and so forth. But there's also the Lothair Institute for Community and Ecology, which I started about 7 years ago, and I quit teaching at the university 6 or 7 years ago, in large part because of what I concluded about Lothair, the earth, that we're in the Necrocene, we're in the new era of death on earth, and we're in a social crisis, and we're in an ecological crisis, and we have to think about it. We have to think about the earth, and I love the fact that in French and Spanish and certain other languages, that the link between the two is so clear. But even in English, there is the planet Earth, and there's also, we don't usually say it, but the earth beneath our feet is also called Earth. And we have to think about both of those. We have to think about the planet, we have to think about the biosphere, we have to think about the 6th great mass extinction, we have to think about the 6 or 7 other planetary boundaries that are being transgressed, and as it's formulated in one analysis. And then we also have to think about the earth where we are. And we think about that a lot here, because when I drove here, I drove up Cancer Alley, which is some people now call it death alley, because there are a lot more things than cancer that it's causing in people here. So we have to think about what's happening. We have to think about world system theory. We have to think about the center and the periphery, and how really we're in the semi-periphery here in so many ways. I mean, that's another subject that really deserves a lot of attention. How do we analyze society, not only as spheres of social determination, not only in terms of production, consumption, but also in terms of some of those kind of concepts, which tell us how people are really living in different worlds. I spent like 10 years fighting against this terrible transnational corporation, Freeport-McMoRan, alias Freeport Indonesia, which was involved in genocide and ecocide against the Papuan people. And, they can have their little colonies of the core in the midst of the periphery. And Indonesia can kind of try to create a semi-periphery in their colony of West Papua. And unless you really understand these details about how the world works, you can't act effectively. And I'm very grateful that I found out about the Papuan people, and I learned so much in the 10 years that I worked with them. And it really was a turning point, because after that I started working with Tibetans and then other indigenous people. But it was really in that where Max Caffard emerged, and I was seeing problems with a very Eurocentric kind of ideology that I was involved in. And, working with the Papuans and dealing with neo-colonialism and economic imperialism and all of these things, the Suharto dictatorship, it's a very complex story. But this is what education is about. So the idea of La Terre Institute is that we need educational institutions that are our own. We need our own schools, our own institutes, our own programs, our own Ateneos, Athénée in French. Every neighborhood should have one of these schools. And I realized this almost 50 years ago. In a very vague, amorphous way. I was already writing about this, in a very inept way. But it's taken me, that's why at the beginning of that book, I wrote whatever it is, Reflections of a Slow Learner. Because it takes a while. And if it were not for the Papuans that I ended up working with them, if it were not for the Tibetans, I joined an organization, and then it ended up that they have worked with refugees in India, and I started taking students, and they would be paired up with refugees, and it was just a transformative experience to our students. Gradually, and the experiential part is so important. So there's a chapter in the book about education for empire, or education for whatever else I said, liberation, I guess. So we have to think about that. So La Terre Institute has not gotten very far in the last 6 years or so, but the aspiration is to be one, and that's really the answer, not what that place is going to be in 50 years, but what the world is going to be like in 50 years. And are we going to have thousands of institutions like that, and thousands of communities, or tens of thousands of communities doing the things that need to be done? That's really the question. And by the way, I got involved in the alternative education movement in the 70s and helped organize when I was a student. We organized these two extravaganza alternative education conferences, and we thought that this was the wave of the future, that free schools, free universities, and all of these things were going to be enormous. And there was this guy, Michael Rossman, who was a big figure in the counterculture, wrote about this. He gave this talk where he said, 3 years ago we had a certain number of free schools. 2 years ago we had like 5 times. This year we have like 10 times as many. In 10 years, most of the schools are going to be free schools. Well, you can't project like that. You have to do the work. That's not the kind of imaginary that we need. like that we extrapolate from something because it's been going well for 3 or 4 years.
Endless growth. It's the commercial statist imaginary. But John, we're out of time, and
Okay, we are out of time. That's our problem.
La Terre, it's
We
such a
need to
gift
work
from
harder.
you to people. Is there anything that people can gift you to help you in this work? You know, I think that's what we're asking. If you want to invite us to.
Well, I think there's a community of people. I mean, there's a huge community of people who are in your periphery who care so much about La Terre and want to support it and do anything we can. We care about it very deeply. And so I guess I think that's what Liz is asking.
Well, get in touch. If somebody's interested, get in touch, and we can discuss what we could do together.
Okay.
And we do have these 2 groups if people are interested in anarchist political ecology or dialectical social ecology. But also, I would love for people to get involved in programs. Obviously, La Terre Institute is kind of officially in New Orleans with programs at Bayou La Terre Woodland Center. But if people can do things in person, either out on the land, we're going to have an art and music program coming up fairly soon. It'll be our first real outreach kind of event with maybe 20 people doing a program together on the land. There's a lot more we can do.
Well, hopefully, yes, we can, and we can also organize a work weekend because we really want to help finish the cabins. But I just wanted to make sure before we go, because we're going to have to go in a moment here, I just want to say thank you. You're a person that I met, I think, 7 years ago at a difficult time in my life when I left Buddhism and decided that I needed to take anarchism very seriously, and you profoundly changed my life, and I am endlessly grateful to you.
I'm very happy to have met you and to have
you too.
Collaborated on so much with both of you in these recent years.
And more to come.
And I'm inspired by what you've created right here.
Right on. Well, wouldn't be here without you. So I'll let you take a minute, shift to the credits, but thank you everybody who tuned in as well. We'll be posting lots of links and video, and thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.